I'm just going to come right out and say it. What is the big deal with end grain cutting boards? I mean, I've never quite understood the pridefulness and self-satisfaction that a lot of makers have around making end grain cutting boards versus making regular cutting boards. I mean, really, is it worth all the fuss? So usually when you make a traditional cutting board, you rip up a bunch of strips, then rotate them all 90 degrees, and glue them all up. That's edge grain. End grain cutting boards, on the other hand, are when the cutting surface is entirely made up with what you see on the end of a board. Immediately you can imagine that making it this way must be way more complicated. So why do it? First, let's quickly talk about the advantages of end grain cutting boards, then we'll talk about the 3 main challenges that I see with making them and how I'm going to tackle those challenges. Now first off, you can make some really visually stunning patterns using end grain, like the brick style cutting board that I'm going to show you how to make today. Next, apparently, according to the internet, end grain is apparently self-healing, meaning you won't see all those knife marks in your board like you do on a regular cutting board. I don't know about that one. They're also more forgiving, which means your knives will stay sharper longer so you don't have to sharpen them as often. Okay. And apparently, still according to the internet, they're antibacterial too. I'm not sure about this one because end grain will actually be more porous, which will absorb more liquid, so I think the theory here is that by having fewer knife marks on the board, there will be less spots for bacteria to go and thrive in, and I think that's what gives it the reputation of being antibacterial. Okay, so we know that end grain cutting boards are supposedly great for all those reasons, so why aren't they all made that way? Well, for one, they take much longer to make and therefore are way more expensive. And from a maker's perspective, there are 3 main challenges I see with making them. The first challenge is that I'll need to cut some really thin strips, which can make a lot of people nervous, but rest assured that I have some tips on how to do this safely. But not only do we need thin strips, we need thin strips with the end grain facing up. And this is because you don't want to mix edge grain and end grain in the same cutting board. You want all the grain facing the same direction. And that's if you mix the two together, the forces will be pulling and competing with each other and may ultimately lead to your board splitting or cracking over time. So we need to make end grain thin strips, and I'll show you how to make those. The second challenge that I have is I'll need to cut up a bunch of strips, then glue them up, and then resaw them into even strips. To do this, I'll build a very simple panel cutting sled, but don't worry, this will be the most simple bare bones jig that you've ever seen. And the third challenge is that you can't run end grain through a planer, so you'll need to find another way to flatten the board after the final glue up. Now a lot of makers will use a drum sander, but I don't have one, so I'll show you how to build a very simple router flattening jig for this instead. Okay, it sounds like I've got my work cut out, so let's get to work. You can make all sorts of end grain cutting boards. I decided to go with a brick pattern made from maple and walnut. I'll start by milling up the rough lumber and cutting my parts to size. I won't bore you with all the details of this process, but if you're interested in making one for yourself, I do have plans available for this build, and you'll find that link down below the video. Alright, so once all is milled and cut, you should have 5 maple boards that are 3 inches and one that's half that size. You'll also need 5 strips of 1/4 inch walnut, and these will all be glued up into a panel. I've also got another set of walnut boards over here that'll be glued up into another separate panel. I know that cutting thin strips, especially when you need 5 of the exact same thickness, can be a little nerve-wracking for some people. So let me show you how I built this super simple thin rip jig in just a few minutes. You'll need 3 parts, and I've listed out the measurements I use on my website if you're interested, but the key here is that one of the boards, the one that goes on the bottom, needs to be the same thickness as the material you're going to be cutting. I'll start by attaching the handle kind of randomly towards the bottom right of this piece of 3/4 inch plywood. First using some CA glue and activator to tack it down, then driving the screws from underneath. Next, I'll attach the second piece underneath, flush with the right edge. And finally, I'll add a sacrificial heel at the back that'll help hook and push the wood through the blade. Just make sure to keep the screws away from the middle so they aren't in the path of the blade. Okay, that's it. It's ready to use. I'll set my blade height so that the tips of the blade just barely touch the top piece. And I'll then set my fence to the width of the bottom piece, plus a 1/4 inch since I want to cut 1/4 inch strips. Alright, so with all our parts cut, it's time to glue up our panels. As I mentioned, I'll be gluing up 2 panels. The first one will alternate maple boards with thin strips of walnut, with a thinner maple strip on the end. I want to be able to run this board through my planer to flatten it out, so I'm going to do the glue up in 2 parts. Well, I mean, I'll do it all with 1 set of clamps, but I just won't put any glue in the middle, so I'll end up with 2 blanks. I'm using Type Bond 3, which is a waterproof glue that's really great for cutting boards. I find it really helps to have a good set of parallel clamps for this, and it makes it way less stressful in my opinion. I'll leave links to these and all the tools I use in the video down below. The second panel glue up is pretty similar, but a lot faster. You'll notice I like to put blue tape on my clamps before I glue up. I find it helps to keep the glue off of them, which can be such a pain to get off once dry, so that's just a little trick I started to use at one point. I like to come back after about 45 minutes and scrape away the squeeze out before it has time to cure using a plastic scraper. The glue is still soft enough to easily scrape away without making a huge mess, like if you were to scrape it away immediately after the glue up. Once dry, I can pull the boards out of the clamps. Unfortunately, while my little tape trick did protect my clamps, it got stuck to the board. So I'll first scrape that off, then run them through the planer on both sides to get both halves perfectly flat. With that done, I can glue together both halves. I want to make sure that this joint is perfectly flush, so I'm adding mini clamps right on the seam to help ensure it stays perfectly aligned. Since I'm not going to use my planer after this, I'll wipe away all the glue with a wet rag. That way I'll have minimal cleanup to do once it's dry, probably just a very light sanding. Alright, next I need to square off one end and then cut it into strips. Now you could use a crosscut sled for this, but I actually don't have one that's big enough. So instead I'm going to build a very simple bare bones panel cutting sled. First up, I'll need a single table saw runner. I used a piece of my leftover maple for this. I find it helps to get the most accurate and straight cut if you use a feather board like this one. I'll test the fit in the miter slot, and once that looks good, I can rip the thickness down to 3/8 so that it'll sit just below the surface. Next, I set my fence to 1/2 inch, then measure the distance from the fence to the center of the runner, and then I'll transfer that distance over to this sheet of plywood. To secure the runners, I'll first drop in some pennies to raise up the runner and help it contact the plywood while I drive in some screws. Like I said, I'm keeping this as simple as possible, nothing fancy here, but feel free to deck this out if you'd like to. With the base pressed up against the fence, I can drill right on the markings I made down into the runner. I'm using a countersink bit with a depth stop to make sure I don't go too far and drill into my table saw. I'll link to it down below if you want to check it out. Okay, once the screws are in, I'll test it out. It slides smoothly, so I can go ahead and trim off the edge to create a zero clearance edge. The last step is to add a stop at the back that's perfectly square to our freshly cut edge. I know walnut seems a little fancy for this, but I'm just using whatever leftovers I have from this project. Whatever you use, make sure that the edge is straight and flat. I'll pre-drill and then drive a screw in the end closest to the blade, which will then allow me to pivot the other end and adjust the angle until it's a perfect 90. For this, you'll want a large square. A 12-inch rafter square like this is good, and if you're looking to pick one up, you can find them at Princess Auto. You can also use a carpenter square, which is even better. I got this one just like most of my layout tools from Princess Auto. Okay, so once it's perfectly square, I'll clamp it down so it doesn't move while I pre-drill and drive in another screw. You can then drive in a few more screws if you want, and that's it. This panel sled is ready to use. So I'll drop in the first panel, butt it up against the backstop, and make sure my blade height is set to the right height, then trim the edge to square it up. Next, I need to cut this up into even strips. Now you may be tempted to ditch the sled and just use the fence to make these cuts. As you can see, I was first inclined to do this myself, but it didn't work out as planned. Because I'm cross-cutting a board that's wider than it is long, it twisted and I got a very unclean cut with a lot of burning. So instead, I did what I should have done in the first place. I used my new panel sled. You never want your workpiece to be in contact with the fence as it passes through the blade when using a sled of any kind on the table saw. Instead, I'll use some double-sided tape to secure a block against the fence well in front of the blade. I want to cut strips that are 1 3/4 inches so that the final thickness of my cutting board will work out to about 1.5 inches. So I'll set my fence to 1 3/4 plus the thickness of my little block. Then as you can see, I can just slide over the panel until it contacts the small block while making sure it stays square against the sled, and then push it through. As you can see, the cuts are very clean, no burn marks like before. When you get towards the end, make sure to use push blocks to help keep the panel from twisting and to protect your hands as you push it through. Without touching my setup, I'll rip the other panel into strips as well. I didn't feel comfortable using the panel saw once the panel was reaching towards the end, so I made the final cuts just using my fence and a push block. There's one more step before the next glue up, and that's to rip our walnut pieces into thin strips. Remember, we don't want to mix grain direction, so we want the face of the board to be entirely end grain, which means I need to rip these on edge into 1/4 inch strips. Now I went back and forth on the best and safest way to do this, but ultimately decided to use the table saw. If I had a drum sander, I would definitely use a bandsaw to rip these first, then sand them all down to an even thickness. Running them through the planer wasn't really an option either due to the grain direction, so the table saw was pretty much my only option. At first I tried to only raise the blade to half the thickness and cut it in 2 passes, flipping the board over in between. The results were decent, but I got a small ridge in the middle that I didn't like. So I decided to rip the full thickness in 1 pass, even though the thought did make me a little nervous. But I used all the safety precautions I could think of. First, a feather board to keep the strip tight against the fence, and second, I used a large piece of 2x6 as a push block to hold the strip down securely against the table. You'll notice a small heel cut at the back which hooks onto the workpiece and helps to safely push it through the blade. Okay, with all of my strips cut, it's time to glue this up into a brick pattern. I'll flip these pieces so that everything facing towards me is end grain. Then simply rotate every second piece 180 degrees so that we start to see the brick pattern forming. This is why the last piece of maple we cut had to be half the size of the others so we would get this offset pattern. And lastly, I'll insert a strip of walnut between each row. All right, so this is what our cutting board should look like. Time to glue it up. Here you can kind of see me debating how to do this since I don't have enough room to flip all my pieces on edge at once. So I decided to work in small sections, only a few boards at once. I applied a generous amount of glue and spread it out with my glue brush. Some people like to use a roller, which may be a little faster, but I like the silicone brush. I tried to keep one end nice and straight so that the pattern lines up. It's a little cold in my garage, as you can tell from the jacket, so once I've got everything in the clamps, I like to bring it into my basement and let it dry in warmer temperatures. Now that it's dry, I need to flatten this board. One side looks pretty decent, but unfortunately my tape on the clamps trick backfired on me again here. You may be tempted to run this through the planer, but I really wouldn't. You never want to run end grain through a planer. I've heard all sorts of stories from tear out to boards splitting in half to planers exploding. It's just not worth the risk. Instead, I'm going to throw together a router flattening jig. I'll only need a few strips of 3/4 inch plywood to build a little sled that's wide enough to fit my router. I'll use pocket screws to secure the sides. If you're interested, I'll list out all the exact dimensions I used to build this specific flattening jig on my website. I'll leave a link down below, or just head over to DIYmontreal.com. Once that's done, I'll use the opening in my router's base plate to trace a slot that I'll then cut out. After drilling a starter hole, I'll use my jigsaw to make the cut. Now you can round the ends if you're so inclined, or just cut them square, whatever you prefer. Square just seemed easier. Even if it's not pretty, it really doesn't matter. The important thing here is just to make sure that the sled is flat. Lastly, I'll close off both ends with small pieces of plywood that'll hang down below the sled and act as hooks so the sled doesn't fall off the rails when you're trying to use it. With that done, I'll cut 2 rails. These need to be just a tad higher than the thickness of the board we're trying to flatten, so I'll cut these to 2 inches. You can use whatever type of wood here. I'm just using a good old 2x6. The important thing is to make sure these rails are flat, parallel, and perfectly identical, as you'll be using them as a reference edge to run the sled along. The jig is now ready to use. I'll start by clamping the rails to my workbench, leaving enough room for the cutting board to fit, plus some extra working room so the bit will have somewhere to go. I cut some spacer blocks using some scraps to fill the gaps on each side and secure the board between the rails. Okay, a quick test to make sure that the setup works and that the sled slides smoothly. Perfect! Speaking of the bit, I'm going to use this flattening bit. Now, the wider the bit, the faster you'll get this done. But to use those big bits, you'll need a powerful router with a 1/2 inch collet. Since I'm using a router with a 1/4 inch collet, I picked up the smallest flattening bit I could find. This one has a 1 inch diameter. It'll take a little longer, but it'll be safer this way. You could even use a 3/4 inch or 1/2 inch bit if that's all you've got. It'll just take a little longer to make your way across the slab. I started by removing the high spots, namely the blue tape and the glue on the surface of the board. With that done, I'll lower the bit until I hit the board, then lower it just a hair more, about a 1/16 of an inch. You only want to take really shallow passes here, no more than 1/8 of an inch. You can repeat the process going a little deeper for as many passes as you need until the board is fully flattened. After one side is done, I'll flip it over and do the other side. The bit I'm using is really short, so I had to raise up my workpiece just a little to get it as close as possible to the sled so that the router bit could easily reach the board. This makes such a mess as you can see, but it works really well. It feels pretty flat to the touch, not as smooth as a freshly planed board for example, but still pretty good. After cleaning everything up, I'll check for flatness and yep, this is looking perfectly flat. Which means it's time to shape and finish this cutting board. At this point, I need to square it up, so I'll go back to my panel sled. I want to cut off the least amount possible here, so I'll just overhang the board about 1/8 of an inch and make the cut. Next, I'll flip it around and square up the other end. Now, what's about to happen could have been really dangerous, but I got lucky. Cutting such a thin strip without using a zero clearance insert, or at least taping off the opening in my table saw, wasn't the best move. Moving on, I'll use a round over bit to round over all the edges of the board. Next comes sanding, and let me tell you, end grain requires a lot of sanding. Since the board is still pretty rough after using the flattening jig, I'll start with 60 grit and go over the entire surface multiple times, moving at a slow, even pace. Then work my way up through the grits until 220. Now at some point during the sanding process, I realized I probably should have added finger slots to make this massive board easier to pick up. I set up a pair of stops on my router table and installed a bowl and tray bit. You know, the one that's kind of rounded at the top? I knew I was going to get some burning using this technique, so I tried to do it progressively in multiple passes, raising the bit and moving the fence back as I went. But unfortunately, that really didn't help. I got a lot of burning. I did my best to sand it off, but it's really hard to get it out completely. So after I sanded up to 220 grit, I water popped the entire board and gave it time to dry. Then came back to sand it again using 220 grit and then 320 grit. Here I'm using a tack cloth to remove all the sawdust before applying a finish. To finish this board, I'm using Total Boat Wood Honey. It's a food-safe mix of oils and waxes. I started using this finish recently on my router bowls, and I just love how easy it is to use and the amber finish it gives to the wood. It really makes the colors pop. By the way, you can get 5% off all Total Boat products by using the link down below. I'll apply a heavy first coat and give it about 20 minutes to soak in. As you can see, the wood really sucks it up. So I'll apply a second coat, and again after another 20 minutes, wipe it all off and buff it out with a clean cloth. The very last step is to add some feet. These are cutting board feet that I picked up on Amazon, and I'll leave a link down below. They're a bit on the small side, so I'll actually link to slightly bigger ones that would be more size appropriate. Just a reminder that I have plans available for this cutting board with all the exact dimensions. Look for the link down below. As it turns out, making your first end grain cutting board is a lot of work, but a really fun challenge. I totally get it now and feel really proud of this build. Once you've got the right jigs, you can really start making these faster and get creative with your designs. Until next time, thanks for watching, see you soon.